thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a delight to be able to host such an eminent panel, and I'm really grateful for our panel for joining us. We have today, I'm going to struggle to know whether to read them in the order they appear on my screen, but we'll stick with alphabetical order. So we have João Costa from who's head of sustainability at the International Hydropower Association, and Jeff Opperman, who's from WWF. He's their global freshwater lead scientist. We have Matthias Pantelli, assistant professor at the University of Cyprus, who works with FutureDAMS, and Jamie Skinner, who's a principal researcher with IIED. So thank you to them for all joining us. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a presentation from Matthias of some of the model results from FutureDAMS and the areas in which we've been working on looking at the role of hydropower in managing the transition. And the transition to net zero inevitably involves more renewables. That means more intermittent renewables, and grids don't like intermittent renewables. Much as everybody in the world loves them, grids don't particularly. And hydropower is in an almost unique position to help with that. So Matthias is going to tell us some more about that, and then I'll ask each of the panel to comment on that afterwards. So without more ado, I'll hand straight over to Matthias and ask him to share his screen, please.
Yep. Thank you, Judith. Can you confirm that you can see my screen? Full?
Can indeed, yes.
Full screen? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Judith, for the introduction and for the invitation to give an overview of our relevant work on this topic for FutureDAMS. So Matthias Pantelli, I used to work at the University of Manchester until December 2020, and after that I moved to the University of Cyprus from earlier this year, but I continue to very actively contribute and support the project with Julian Haru, where we lead basically the water and the energy team respectively within the FutureDAMS project. So in my presentation, I will basically, after giving an overview of the problem and the introduction of the problem and the potential role of hydropower to our low carbon power grids, I will give briefly an overview of a relevant European project that we completed recently at the University of Manchester, which is relevant to this, not touching upon integrated water energy systems, which is the scope of FutureDAMS, but it will give some perspective, let's say, from the European context in the role of hydropower. And then I will move on to provide some more insights from the FutureDAMS relevant work. So very recently, IRENA published a report in June 2021 on the dominant investments in energy transition technologies, as we can see in this slide. So basically, there is a big investment in renewables, as it is discussed now as well in the COP26 week that's happening now. And we can see that beyond renewable energy, which is the dominant clean energy, let's say, transition, it also includes carbon capture storage, electrifying heat transportation. So there is a push to electrify other critical sectors as well, energy storage, and more recently, hydrogen has been emerging as a key player to this energy transition. But these renewable energies, as we know, because of the intermittency, they need, and we need as power system engineers, to have the flexibility services and the ancillary services in order to balance and basically tackle this intermittency and uncertainty with renewables. And traditionally, these flexibility and ancillary services have been coming mainly from fossil fuel generators, for example, coal, gas, nuclear, and so on, which were asked to ramp up or down quickly their output in order to deal with this high variability and uncertainty with renewables. Of course, this is not the greener way of doing things, and we need to develop and to adapt more flexible ways which are greener and more environmental friendly in order actually for the renewables to have a meaning in our system. And recent reports published by the International Hydropower Association and IEA actually argue that hydropower can play a key role in this roadmap towards net zero, as it can provide these fast flexibility services and ancillary services that we need in the system in order to balance and to basically overcome this intermittency of renewables. And an example in Europe that is emerging as a key player in providing large-scale flexibility in balancing and storage in the system is Norway. As we all know, Norway is a hydropower dominated system, and it has the flexibility using pump storage basically to absorb excess renewable energy from Europe, coming mainly from Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany as well, and more recently from UK as well, and due to the interconnector that was recently completed between UK and Norway. There are, of course, big debates if Norway can indeed become Europe's green battery because of many reasons, including market reasons, network constraint, and other various reasons that might become an obstacle towards this increasing role of Norway as a large-scale flexibility provider in Europe. Now, hydropower can and it has a key role in the future in order to provide key flexibility services. And in this slide, we can see different types of these flexibility services that hydropower can provide, ranging from sub-seconds to seconds up to months and years. And this refers to different services which I will aim to cover briefly in my presentation. And in particular, from the shorter term, looking to sub-seconds to minutes time frame, hydropower, as we'll show later on, can provide dynamic stability services in order to balance, basically to provide inertial response to big disturbances, to maintain frequency and voltage into the predefined limits of a power system. And it can also provide intraday balancing of supply and demand, as well as hydrothermal coordination and adequacy. Other ongoing work that we have, and we share some preliminary resources, refer to scheduling and adequacy, as well as power system planning over a longer duration of time. So the European project that I will give a brief overview on is the H2020 funded project called Crossbow. That the University of Manchester were tasked to develop what's called a regional storage coordination center, which basically it is, as the name says, it is a regional optimizer, which basically aims to coordinate and distribute battery storage systems and pump storage across the Sava River in southeastern Europe in order to provide different services, including increasing the RES penetration and deal with the congestion management. Because when we have big power flows coming on the tie lines between different systems, there can be a congestion in the transmission corridor, limiting the ability of the power system to absorb renewables. And also different services such as frequency and voltage stability, as we'll say in the next slides, when there is a big disturbance of the system, how hydropower can indeed provide frequency and voltage regulation. So as a small overview, this application, let's say the storage coordination center, will sit as a product in the regional security control center in Belgrade, in Serbia, where basically conceptually it will have a large penetration of wind mainly across Southeastern Europe. The role of this storage coordination center is to indeed coordinate and manage these distributed storage resources across the system by sending basically control signals for charging and discharging in order to optimize the tie line power flows and the penetration of renewables in the system. So the role is to indeed provide real-time flexibility to the interconnected Southeastern Europe in order to accommodate the higher and higher penetration of renewables in a flexible and reliable manner. And this diagram shows basically an overview in a more sophisticated way, let's say, of this storage coordination center optimizer, where basically it sits and interconnects with a wider measurement system in Southeastern Europe, and where it takes different measurements from energy storage units and hydro pumps. It takes basically the status of the grid as inputs, and it sets out basically set points for the energy storage units and hydro pumps in order to operate accordingly, depending on the evolving status of the system, in order to optimize basically its operation in real time. So a case study application I will be showing today refers to the interconnected Serbian and Bulgarian network. And in this figure, we can see only the Serbian network because of problems with the size of the network, which basically in the Serbian network, we have one pumped hydro station, which is the Bagina Vasta hydro pump station. And we consider 3 different storage scenarios, let's say. So we'll consider no utilization of storage. We'll consider utilizing only the national storage in Serbia. And the third scenario is basically utilizing regional storage by considering the interconnected Serbian and Bulgarian network. So basically utilizing in a way the storage that we have available in Bulgaria. So the first result is what we see in the slide now, where basically we managed through the STOC optimizer to reduce the wind curtailment in real time. And we did run experiments in Serbia, which unfortunately, because of confidentiality issues, I cannot share. And indeed, the STOC optimizer works perfectly in real time. And what we can see in the slide is basically the rest curtailment for the 3 scenarios: no storage, which is the blue line, where we can see that we have a big curtailment of wind in Serbia. The black line is the national storage, where basically we optimized the operation of the Bagina Vasta hydro pump station to support the intermittency of renewables, which we can see that they reduced in a decrease in the rest curtailment. And this curtailment was further reduced when we're actually utilizing the storage available from Bulgaria, both battery storage units and pumped hydro. So basically we can see that moving from no storage to regional storage, the rest curtailment reduced a lot, which highlights the impacts and the benefits of a more regional management and coordination of available storage. The STOC optimizer can also provide different frequency regulation services as well. And in this simple example, we show basically for the tripping of different big synchronous generators in the Serbian network, which is the straight lines in these 2 examples. We see that there was a big frequency drop when these generators went out. And the dotted lines basically show the frequency behavior by utilizing cross-border distributed storage coordination. And where we see that basically with the STOC application, we managed to reduce a lot the frequency nadir that was observed in the system. And we help basically the system to withstand and recover from these big disturbances. And the same stands for the voltage regulation as well, where we managed to reduce significantly the voltage deviation following an event, which enables basically its quicker restoration after the disturbance has been restored. And this last point on this project before going into the more FutureDAMS relevant work is that through, as I said earlier, through the STOC application, we can actually send operational set points to the Bagina Vasta pump hydro station, either to absorb or to release water respectively for increasing or reducing the output, the power output. And we have quantified basically these set point signals that have to be sent in real time to the hydropower station. So through this project, we actually demonstrate the role of hydropower in increasing rest penetration and providing ancillary services, frequency and voltage regulation, as well as managing the congestion on the system. So moving into the FutureDAMS relevant work that we have been working on this with the team of Julia for the last years. We did develop an integrated water energy simulator and design framework, which we can see in this slide, which is mainly composed out of 3 simulation engines, the Python Energy System Simulator, which we call in short PyNCs, the Python Water Resource Management, PyWR, and the Python Network Modeling Simulator, PINSIM, which the last two were led from Julian's team in the last years, which are also open access. And we couple these simulators with AI techniques and within multi-criteria design frameworks using these integrated spatially explicit power and water resources simulators in order, as I will show later, to basically assess and define different planning intervention scenarios towards low carbon power grids. So the case study that I will be presenting refers to the Ghanaian water energy system. And then Ghana's total electricity generation mixture is basically hydropower dominated, as we can see on the slide. And it also has gas and oil generation resources. But Ghana's national policy now pushes for larger and larger scale development of variable renewable energy, mainly supported by the flexibility that can be provided by the Akosombo hydro generation plant, which is about 1 gigawatt of installed capacity and is located in the south of the country. So what we did within the project and with Julian's team is basically we had different challenges to overcome when it comes to to the planning of the Ghanaian system. And we had to meet future energy demands, reduce emissions, as well as other targets while minimizing the hydrological disruption and by not considering the building of any new dams in the system. And as we'll see later, we define scenarios of amending basically the operation of the dams into a more hydro peaking operation in order to support the intermittency of the renewable penetration in the system. And we have different series of objectives, including costs, low curtailment, CO2 emissions, hydrological alteration, and so on and so forth, which we aim to optimize within a multi-objective in a multi-objective way. And the way we managed to do that was by expanding the variable renewables in the system, including solar, wind, and biogas, and building new lines, as well as amending the reservoir operation. And we designed 3 scenarios for this. Scenario 1 was updating the operating rules of hydropower. Scenario 2 was updating the flexible operating rules and also including new transmission lines. And in scenario 3, we also included bioenergy in the system as a more dispatchable, flexible resource. So this figure shows the results of many scenarios that we did run in the project. And in the top, you can see basically the objectives and the decision variables we had in the analysis. And from top to bottom is basically the preference across all these objectives and decision variables. So the first point to make here is that basically while operating the Akosombo Dam using basically as a base load as it happens now, we can see that basically we do not achieve the maximum potential that we have in the system for integrating more and more renewables in the system. And also we can observe some annual load curtailment and high carbon emissions as well in the system. By amending the operation of the Akosombo Dam into a more hydro peaking operation, logically the hydrological impact increases, but we can see that basically this more flexible operation of the dam leads to higher penetration of intermittent renewables. We can also see an improvement into other indices as well, including the annual load curtailment and the emissions we have in the system, which however had to be supported by new transmission infrastructure in the system, as we can see in the right hand side of this figure. In the third scenario, where we basically had new transmission lines as well as new bioenergy generation in the system, which is important to note that it is a renewable generation, but more dispatchable generation. We can see that basically we managed to improve many indices across different sectors, let's say. So we reduced basically the hydrological alteration into the Akosombo Dam, and we also improved the agricultural yield, the annual load curtailment, as well as the emissions we had in the system. And we also managed to reduce somehow the needed transmission line expansion for supporting these scenarios in the system, but with a much higher penetration of bioenergy within the system. So basically the combination of these three approaches, updating the operating rules, a new transmission system and bioenergy services, improves its welfare system performance and enables reducing significantly the emissions for the country. And this figure just basically briefly shows the spatial distribution of different technologies that we developed across the country, which includes solar PV, solar PV with storage, wind and biogas. And it also shows the transmission needs for connected and different regions in Ghana, as well as within the regions, the transmission facilities that are required. Now, by amending the operating rules of hydropower, we can basically see the results in this figure, in the top right figure mainly, where basically the orange figure is the more historical operating rules, where we can see that there is some hydro peaking, but it mainly follows the demand as a base load operation. When we move into the updated rule scenario, which is the blue line here, we can see a much significant higher hydro peaking in the system, which, however, as we can see in the top right figure, can have an impact on the irrigation deficit, which is not desired. The red figure, the red curve here, basically on the top right figure, shows the scenario where we do have the updated operating rules for hydro peaking, but supported with transmission infrastructure as well as dispatchable biogas generation, where we can see that basically the hydro peaking reduces across the year, and it also reduces the irrigation deficit, as we can see from the red line in the top and in the bottom right figure. So basically a combination of these intervention scenarios, as I said, by updating the operating rules with more transmission infrastructure and more biogas dispatchable generation, it can reduce significantly the irrigation deficit in the country. And we also did run some other studies because of the complexity of the problem. We assessed basically the impact of different modeling assumptions in these integrated studies. And we can see here some sensitivities that were considered in the case study, including water availability, rest penetration, the stress on the system, temperatures, as well as different modeling options by including or not the network in the power system, unit commitment, these piecewise power losses that we have in power systems, and other factors that can affect the computational efficiency, the accuracy, as well as the cost and the load shedding of the system, which I don't want to go into much details on this, but if you need any more further details, I will be happy to provide. So basically, to answer the question if hydropower can lead basically the decarbonization pathways for Ghana and more generally in countries around the globe, hydropower, as we've seen in this presentation, as a low carbon, renewable and flexible generation, it offers indeed unique benefits compared to other IMBR inverter based basically resource interface renewable generation, such as PV and wind, which despite the improvements in technology, we're still facing big issues in balancing basically these IBR interface renewable technologies, as we've seen recently in Europe, where we had a low wind potential across Europe, and we basically had to turn on coal and gas generators to support the system. In Texas, there was a blackout last year where basically, and because of shortage of gas with a big combination of solar penetration, there was a wide scale blackout in Texas. So the short answer in this question is yes, hydropower can lead the way, but we need basically to amend in a careful way the traditional operating rules of hydropower to a more hydro peaking operation for supporting renewables. But as we've seen in this presentation, in order to avoid cascading social, economic, and ecological effects, This hydro peaking will need to be supported by appropriate infrastructure investments, as well as, where possible, other dispatchable generation, such as bioenergy that we see in this presentation. And basically, in order to enable these multi-sector synergies and limit these difficult trade-offs, we need new multi-sector stakeholder engagement and design processes in order to design the system in a more integrated nexus approach. In my opinion, hydropower can also help dealing with the ongoing energy crisis, where, as I said, because in the last year, the wind potential that was predicted for Europe was significantly lower. On average, across Europe, it was around 30 to 40% of less wind generation that was predicted, which led to a big dependence on the fossil fuel generation that we have in the system, which in turn led to a big increase in the prices of gas, coal, and so on, which is reflected in the tariffs that the end users, the customers, will have to, will be called to basically pay. There are different incentives and different support from the governments in Europe, including UK. Ofgem recently published some supporting, let's say, mechanisms for the customers, which, however, funding came mainly from investments that were otherwise being considered for expanding renewable pathways. So basically, by using the flexibility of hydropower, we can reduce the dependency on the traditional fossil fuel generators for providing flexibility towards a more renewable future for Europe and developing countries around the globe. And I also seen recently this nice index that I liked from Irina's Energy Transition Welfare Index, which basically I think covers and gives a nice broad perspective of the different dimensions that we need to consider in this energy transition, including economic, social, environmental, distributional, and access as well issues when moving to a low carbon system. That was it from me, Judith. I hope it wasn't too long.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Matthias. That's great. Now, we've had a couple of questions in the chat, but I'll ask the other members of the panel to speak first, and then we'll come to some questions a bit later. But feel free to put questions in the chat if you would like to. So I think we'll start with Jamie. Jamie, would you like to respond to what Matthias has just said, and perhaps talk a bit about the impact on communities of these change in operation of hydropower projects?
Yes, thank you very much, Judith, and thanks, Matthias, for a very interesting presentation. What it raises in my mind is the huge change that is going to happen in coming years on existing and new hydropower developments in order to specifically support the penetration of renewables. And those renewables, if it's wind or solar, there are going to be hours or days at a time when they're not available, and hydropower and perhaps other forms of storage is going to have to kick in. So communities living downstream of a hydropower plant are going to be facing much more unpredictable circumstances in future than they are today, where most of the hydropower, well, there is some hydro peaking, obviously, is baseload generation, where flows are fairly stable. The resources on which people depend are available to them for the seasons in which they need them. So I can imagine a situation, for example, downstream of Akosombo, where there are some 450 communities living, where their dry season irrigation water might well be below their pump intakes for many hours a day. And they're going to have to rethink how they manage to get access to river water during the day. Perhaps there's a minimum flow in the river, perhaps there's a minimum height, perhaps there's a re-regulating weir that is going to sustain flows. Equally, for those that are doing cage fish farming, maybe the rapid peaking of flows in the river is going to wash away their infrastructure. On the positive side, I can see improvements on, for example, schistosomiasis and malaria, where many of those parasitic hosts are dependent on stable ecosystem conditions. And if there's high variation from hour to hour and day to day, perhaps those vectors won't survive quite so well. I think that what I take away from the community perspective is just how much more complicated it's going to be to think through the implications of multiple different ways of running a hydro peaking project, including both base load over several days when intermittents fail completely, and peaking power when they are sustaining some demand but unable to meet the peaks. All of that is going to introduce significant downstream complexities. And I can see, for example, in Scotland, when we do hydro peaking, the rate at which the river flow is allowed to increase is limited. The dams are not allowed to immediately go from 0 to 100% generation. They have to ramp up gradually because of the downstream security concerns of riverine communities and fishermen who might well be standing in the river when the dams get opened. So there needs to be a whole range of new tools available to downstream communities to understand what is happening upstream of them, and to know that maybe 6 o'clock in the morning tomorrow is not the best time to go out in your canoe if you're going to get swept away by a hydropower peaking release. And this is going to cause, I think, challenges for dam developers in order to predict exactly what the regimes are going to be under different scenarios of peaking or base load. And already we know that downstream communities suffer quite a lot from changing flows, and this just adds another level of complexity to those calculations. And secondly, the operators themselves who are reoperating current dams will need, I think, to go through a broader process of consultation with downstream communities in order to have some sense of how their changed operations are going to impact those livelihoods downstream, which in many cases have already taken 10 or 20 years to adapt to the previous change when the dam was built in the first place. So a whole new set of perturbations coming down the line for those communities. Just the last point I'd like to make is the other thing that struck me in Matteo's presentation is just how critical the system as a whole is. And he showed very clearly that by thinking about the impacts in advance in your system design process, by building transmission lines in Ghana and increasing particular forms of intermittence, you can actually then run your hydro peaking power within an acceptable level, with an acceptable degree of change for the hydro ecosystem alteration downstream. And I think that's a very important lesson. You can't just reoperate a single asset. You need to think about the system as a whole and to use all the opportunities to reduce the downstream perturbations that you possibly can at the system scale. So thank you for that, Judith.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Yes, I think that really struck me too, the difference in those scenarios in the way that you managed Akosombo is it's really interesting, and it gives a huge range to what kind of impacts you would expect from that. Now I'd like to turn to Jeff, who will talk to us a bit about the perhaps the water and environmental flows aspects of this. Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the talk. And I guess I'll preface by saying, you know, from the perspective of working for a conservation organization and being a conservation scientist, this conversation is taking place during the climate COP. And so, you know, I clearly just want to underscore that the preeminent goal here is to have low carbon power systems, and in fact to be decarbonizing or to be moving to electrifying other sectors and then supplying them with low carbon electricity. And so again, from a conservation perspective, we might look at dams and think about impacts, but we really have to put ourselves in this position of saying we absolutely need to have low carbon power systems. So that's a given. How are we going to then provide the those power systems that have the least amount of impacts on a variety of resources, knowing that almost any of our choices are going to have impacts. It's not, we don't have the luxury of just saying, well, let's go with the one that has no impacts. We're going to be choosing from among a set of options that will have impacts on different resources. And to think about that, to pick up on how Jamie concluded, he was talking about the system scale. And what I thought was so interesting about Dr. Pantelli's presentation is, as he was showing the integration of more components to a system, at least my interpretation is we were seeing the performance improving across a number of those objectives. So moving from the scenario 1 to 2 to 3, 3 integrating the most options, and the one that integrated the most options was finding the broadest range of solutions across a range of metrics. So I found that to be intriguing, if I got that interpretation right, and a good confirmation that when we move to the system scale, our chances for finding a solution that is able to provide the benefits we're looking for while minimizing the impacts we're trying to avoid, it just becomes that much easier to do when we consider a broader range of options for meeting those needs. So clearly, hydropower will be one of the ways that we meet the specific stresses on grids that will come from a dramatic increase of wind and solar. And I often talk with colleagues and say, well, sure, let's promote as much wind and solar as possible, but we're going to reach a point where then we have to say, well, what else? And so we have to be able to make some tough choices, and we have to be clear-eyed about those choices. One thing, I guess this is sort of a question, but just throwing that out there, the example from the Balkans had a big emphasis on renewables and storage, and then integrated renewables, storage, and integration. And that seemed to be the solution set. The example from Ghana was renewables, transmission, and then dispatchable energy. So bioenergy or reoperation of an existing hydropower major project. So I would be curious to see, well, what happens in Ghana if we look at storage options? So what about batteries? What about adding a pump storage project above Akosombo? And what I find intriguing about pump storage is the potential for it to do all of that peaking and load following and firming up and dispatchability and all that in ways that potentially minimize impacts on rivers. So Jamie already started talking about the social impacts of rapid fluctuations, and they all have their exact corollaries in biophysical systems. Systems that have lots of peaking and rapid fluctuations. You have a river ecosystem that every day goes from the equivalent of a historic drought to a 1 in 10 year flood or more, and that's pretty dramatic for ecosystems. And so can we begin to use hydropower in ways where we don't have those sort of dramatic impacts? And so well-sited pump storage, off-channel pump storage, or a smaller upper reservoir above a bigger reservoir where the flow distortions are not passed downstream. We can also start thinking about cascade operations with the lowest dam operated as a re-regulation reservoir, perhaps adding re-regulation reservoirs. And then Jamie already mentioned various best practices. If there is going to be hydro peaking, having best practices in place to minimize impacts. But I just think there's a lot of really interesting research questions and questions for us to all be discussing together about how to move towards this role of hydropower, firming up intermittent renewables and doing it in ways that can minimize those flow distortions. And taking that system scale approach that Jamie already raised and that essentially Dr. Pantelli was exploring, I think that is how we're going to be able to find these kinds of solutions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I'd now like to turn to João Costa and ask him to tell us a bit about ways in which we can deal with some of the impacts which we may need to deal with to reach that low carbon grid which Jeff talked about. So João, over to you.
Thanks, Judith, and thank you all. This is has been very interesting to be listening to Mateo's presentation and Jamie and Jeff. And what I'm going to talk about here is the hydropower sustainability standard. So what I'm going to talk about is not framing this standard and as an exclusive solution to managing environmental and social impacts of hydropower projects, but it can be part of the solution, and it should fit also with a system scale planning, of course. So having said that, my message here is aligned with the need of having hydropower to back up more renewables and variable renewables, but also to address climate change mitigation and resilience and water and energy needs. As we've all said here, it has social and environmental impacts, and this is where this standard comes in. This standard comes in as a framework, as a certification scheme that offers a methodology to audit a hydropower project in order to understand its environmental and its social impacts, but also the needs of water and energy and the strategic fit of a project, right? So offers this methodology that enables hydropower stakeholders to frame and understand all these complex social and environmental issues, from downstream flows to erosion and sedimentation, to climate change mitigation and resilience, to resettlement, indigenous peoples, biodiversity, cultural heritage. It's a range of 26 topics that are covered here that are common in hydropower projects, and it's important to address them at some stage of the hydropower project development, right? So these standards can be used during the preparation stage of a project, or planning, during the construction, and during the operations. And what it will do is we'll identify the key impacts and the risks of that project, and understand if these risks are being properly assessed, managed, if the stakeholders are being properly engaged in this process of development, and if they support the project as well. And finally, it looks at the outcomes of all this work that a project developer does in terms of avoiding, minimizing, mitigating, and or compensating for these environmental and social impacts. So there's this this whole structure that was formed and can be used to evaluate all types of hydropower projects. Pump storage is one example, reservoir or storage projects, run of river, and it has been used in all the different types of projects. And I'm talking about the standard today. And this standard was launched actually last month. But this standard is built on this solid scientific basis and these solid hydropower sustainability tools that have been around for around 10 years and have been used in all types of projects in many different economic contexts. So it's in a way, the technical requirements of the standard are very solidly proven for around 10 years now. And by developing these methodology into a certification scheme, what we aim is to incentivize the use of these sustainability tools, the incentivize improvement in projects, incentivize the strive for developers to engage better with the communities, to avoid or mitigate or minimize the biodiversity impacts as early as possible, and basically provide a carrot that can be sought right by developers. This standard is one interesting aspect of it, is it was developed is based, as I said, on these hydropower sustainability tools, and its foundations are quite unique in the sense that they are multi-stakeholder. So it wasn't developed only by the industry, but it also was developed by NGOs, by financial institutions, by governments as well. So we had, the World Bank, WWF, Citigroup, Oxfam, etc., on the origins of these sustainability tools, which are now framed as a standard. And these tools and this standard is still today governed by this multi-stakeholder organism, which we call the Hydropower Sustainability Council. And it still, oversees the use of this standard and also the quality of the standard. So there's a quality control behind it. There's an assurance system that tries to make sure that the standard is well used and that is also up to date scientifically. So it's our job to also keep it alive and keep it up to date. So basically what this standard allows is for all hydropower developers or any stakeholder to look at this technology as with other renewables, look at it dispassionately and, try to understand if it makes sense in a certain location or not. If it doesn't make sense, we shouldn't use it. If it does make sense, we should pursue that. And, how do we tell? Well, that's why we need standards. And that's where this tool and this standard can provide clarity and benefit everyone involved in these decisions. So thank you, Judith. I'm happy to have answer any questions on this, but I'll stop here for now. I hope it was a brief introduction of what is kind of also complex and complete set of requirements. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you, Judith.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So some fascinating points there. And let me just ask whether there are any burning questions from the panel, or if not, I'll go straight to the chat. But if there are questions you'd like to ask, you can shout, you can think about them for a minute. There's actually one in the chat that I'm particularly keen to answer myself, and I'm going to abuse my power as chair to do so. Yasser asked whether hydropower has a reasonable payback period for storage to return the initial investment, or do we need government incentives to make it economically viable? Well, that's slightly a how long is a piece of string question, because it depends where the hydropower project is and what the payment mechanisms are for it. But I think the thing that we need to touch on is that just as the operational rules need to change on a hydropower project in order for it to operate flexibly rather than perhaps as baseload power, or in whatever way makes most sense for the operator, if we're changing that to whatever makes most sense for the grid, then we need to incentivize the operator to do that. And at the moment, there are very few countries who have got a good system of incentivizing storage dams to offer flexibility. One of the few that has got a very clear system is actually the Republic of Ireland, which has a system called the DS3, which names 13 different system services which they're prepared to pay for. And it makes a very interesting case study if you want to look it up. I think the point that many governments have got to realize, and perhaps particularly system operators have to start to realize, is that these services have traditionally been considered a kind of free gain from having hydropower on the system. That you could use hydropower to strengthen a grid and you could assume that that flexibility would be there. And if you're going to make use of that more than just in emergencies, if it's going to be an everyday occurrence, then we're actually going to have to pay for that flexibility. But to answer Yasser's original question, you shouldn't build hydropower storage unless it can return its initial investment. It shouldn't generally need government incentives to make it viable, but that depends a little bit on how much you want to charge for electricity. So if the government wants subsidized electricity, then it may have to subsidize its generation. But we do need new ways of funding the payment for electricity to take account of those services which we're going to ask it to provide. So that's my little 5 minutes worth. Does anybody else want to add something into that? Or Yasser, if you've got a follow-up point to that.
Yes, Saleju, thanks very much for a detailed explanation. So I might going to be a bit direct here. So I was wondering if you're somebody going to choose between the hydropower storage or maybe compressed air storage, since we have two sites for compressed air, they actually been in the market for a while. So why not going to compressed air storage? At the same time, also going to have a discussion between the future of network, the power network, moving toward the micro power networks, where people are going to store the produced or generated renewable energy on site rather than sending it to the grid in order to control the balance and other challenges. So how then hydropower can actually cope with this policy or with this trend of moving toward the micro power grid?
Okay, so in terms of compressed air storage, it's still at the moment very expensive and comparatively small scale. So, you can do a 1500 megawatt hydropower project. Compressed air storage is down at the tens of megawatts, not the hundreds of megawatts. So it's small and it's expensive. Apart from that, it's wonderful. And in terms of microgrids, unfortunately, this happens to be a little hobby horse of mine. So, microgrids are great if you're a small village with a large number of power system options, all of which can be developed in order to give you some backup. But I think that it is unfair to say to some villages that we will give them a second-class power system by saying that they can have a microgrid. They've got one form of generation on it. Maybe it's solar. Maybe we give them a battery to store it. Great. But if the sun doesn't shine or the battery fails, they've got no electricity. Now, the great thing about the kind of grid that we're delighted to be sitting in is that if one form of generation fails, then you expect the system to provide you with electricity from a different form of generation. And if you can provide that level of service on a microgrid, great. But as yet, I don't think we can, and not very expensively, because if to provide that level of service on a microgrid, you've got to invest in at least 2 and preferably 3 forms of on-site generation. And don't get me started on batteries, because I'll have to put up pictures of cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's fine. We're worried like crazy about the environmental impacts of hydropower projects, but buying batteries is wonderful, despite the fact that, my colleague has some great statistics about the percentage of women in cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo who have been raped in the past year. And it's about 80%. I mean, the human rights abuses in mines in Congo are ridiculous. And we cannot assume that we can make our grid clean by exporting our environmental problems to the mining communities of the Congo.
Thanks very much. I couldn't imagine a better explanation than this. Thanks very much. Thank you.
If I may add as well, Judith, your response,
Yeah,
which was indeed very comprehensive, to Yasser. Basically, yes, it really depends on the scale of the services that you would like to get out of a particular flexibility provider. I mean, hydropower has the capability of providing large-scale services, which can respond very quickly to large-scale disturbances in the system and so on. I mean, we did studies in Manchester and now with my team in Cyprus, looking at how aggregated, basically distributed smaller resources, let that be network microgrids or whatever, can provide this kind of flexibility services. And the conclusion that we came up is that we need thousands or millions of customers to actually agree to enter this kind of schemes and to provide meaningful services to the system. So there you also have very much the social perspective as well. And there you enter other schemes, which Judith touched upon as well. I mean, you have the willingness to pay, the willingness to accept from the customers, their willingness basically to participate to these flexibility services, because we as engineers can say whatever we like. We can aggregate millions of microgrids, millions of PV and so on, but unless the customer agrees to participate in this kind of initiatives, it's meaningless. So we need to take into serious account as well the social side and the participation indeed of the end users in this kind of big flexibility services. That is a small parenthesis from me, Judith.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matteo. I wonder if anybody would like to make a comment on hydrogen. Andrew Slaughter has asked whether hydrogen is part of the solution to the intermittency of renewables. Matthias, do you have
Yeah, I could potentially give a few thoughts here. Indeed, I mean, UK published what they call a hydrogen strategy recently, where basically they are expecting to have 5 gigawatts of hydrogen generation by 2030. That's quite ambitious if you consider basically, I think it was Jeff saying about system scale improvements with different technologies. And that is doable. I mean, we're talking about green hydrogen to actually be renewable hydrogen. That's fine. The technology still compared to other, I mean, I'm going to say batteries, Judith, despite your comment, but with other battery storage technologies and so on, and with electricity in general, is still not there, in my opinion. The electrification of heating, transportation, and so on is way ahead in terms of technology and adoption and application compared to hydrogen, but it is indeed a promising technology for the future. Now, how fast it will be developed in a cost-efficient way as well, because we've seen with batteries that is still considered kind of expensive solution, despite we've been developing and working modeling batteries for years now. Hydrogen is picking up as an emerging technology indeed, but in my opinion, it will take some time to catch up, let's say, with other technologies. But there is a couple of hydrogen houses in UK already operating fully on hydrogen, which looks impressive.
Yes, absolutely. Really interesting issues around hydrogen. I think somebody announced yesterday that they were going to be importing enough hydrogen into Britain to green hydrogen to power half of the trucks in Britain. But they're importing it from Australia. They didn't seem to have a clear plan as to how it was going to get here. But you can apparently either ship it as liquid hydrogen or as ammonia. But
yeah, and Australia now, Judith, because of the push of not export. I mean, Australia is a traditional coal exporter as a main income for the country, and now they're shifting towards green hydrogen. I mean, they have many areas to install PV and then produce hydrogen and then export it. And that's where this big import is coming from Australia or UK. But indeed, transportation efficiency is a big another issue that has to be addressed. For large-scale transportation, as you said, trucks, trains, airplanes, and so on, it might be efficient, but for transportation, I mean, for cars and so on, it's still not. I mean, electric vehicles are the technology to stay for some years now.
Yeah, That's good, because I don't want to get rid of mine. Okay. Any other members of the panel wanted to add comments on those points? Nope. You all right? Okay. So Samuel very helpfly added to the points about compressed air in the chat. So thank you very much. And yes, I commented, so you can catch up on that. Samuel, is there anything that you'd like to add to the rest of us about the different storage options? Maybe we've lost Samuel. It's okay. Okay. Zoe, other questions, anybody? I had one that I was going to follow up with Jeff on. Closed loop pump storage. Pump storage, for anybody who's not familiar with the term, pump storage which doesn't take water out of a river, but basically reuses the same water in two separate reservoirs. So what are the advantages from an environmental point of view, apart from just the impact on flows? Are there any other major issues with doing closed loop pump storage, Jeff?
I would think that the minimizing flow alteration would be the primary one. And I actually am very curious about, the adding an upper reservoir above a major reservoir, which would not be called closed loop because the major lower reservoir would be on a channel. But to the extent that if there's an existing dam like Akasombo, which is an enormous reservoir, if there were any locations to put a upper reservoir above that and have that pass back and forth, in fact, you could argue there's some advantages to that. You're only building one new reservoir and perhaps have the ability to tie into existing transmission lines, depending on where it's sited. So I think that at least personally, I'm not speaking for WWF here because this is kind of a newer topic for us, or newer topic for me to be responding to. But I think the main point is looking for pump storage options that minimize environmental impacts, and maybe not requiring them to have a certain category, but just looking at what are the impacts of different options, and then pursuing those that meet the grid requirement with the lowest impact.
Absolutely. I think retrofitting pump storage onto existing hydropower is something which I think we haven't yet fully got to grips with in terms of the advantages, because it has to be more efficient than building a new one. And I think we need to, there's more research needed there on what's possible and how to do it.
Well, I think just on that, Judith, is a good point about whether we can retrofit easily dams that have power stations at the foot of the wall. If you're interested in raising the water level at the foot of a dam, you're probably going to flood a $300 million power station outlet. So are we now going to have to rethink the whole design of new systems that don't have the power station at the dam foot? Or is it even feasible to think about what you might do with re-regulating weirs in the presence of those power stations that are often right at the very, 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 very bottom, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. Yes. And I think there's a lot to be said for the need to build flexibility in to our future builds, and whether it's for adding pump storage or whether it's for adding additional generators and things like that. I think the difficulty in predicting hydrology for the future is going to require more flexibility. Julian, you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Judith, and thanks to the panel. Great to hear some nice discussion. I just wanted to ask João Costa from IHA. You know, Jeff and, well, especially Mateus and Jeff, you know, have been talking about some systems analysis type solutions. So system scale, cumulative analyses that look at combinations of hydropower dams. Do you feel that from IHA's perspective, do you feel like, you know, because the IHA is typically doing certification for individual hydropower assets, do you feel like we could maybe have another certification scheme that looks at, you know, the role that the hydropower dam plays within the wider system, both the environmental system, but for example, as discussed today, the power system? I mean, some dams are probably not really going to contribute as much to the grid and to the ability to integrate intermittent renewables, whereas other dams might do so very much. And so from a green finance perspective, for example, it would be good to know, you know, which dam does what. And so is this kind of system scale evaluation of hydropower dams something that the hydropower sustainability protocol could perhaps take on in the future?
Thanks, Julian. That's an amazing question. And we did discuss that internally a lot. So to develop this sustainability protocol into the standard, as we created a working group, right? And for maybe a year or so, we worked and we discussed this project. Okay, we're certifying a project. Can we certify a cascade? Can we certify a whole fleet? You know, companies will want to want the reputation not for a single project, but, you know, hydropower developer want to have the reputation for the whole company. And maybe a country will want to have a label of sustainability for their hydropower fleet as a country, right? So we discussed all of that, but we have to face the limitations of a tool that was developed to tackle a project by project. Yes, there's a possibility to embed it in the certification to certify a cascade of dams if they fill a certain number of criteria, including being close to each other, including you know, having the same management operator, for example. So there are sets of requirements that need to be fulfilled in order to certify more than one dam. And those are quite particular cases, which we are open to do that. Basically, what limits is the sampling, right? When you do an assessment with this standard of a project, you have to sample evidence and you have to interview communities and stakeholders, you have to review documentation, you have to do a site inspection, right? So there's limitations to that. You cannot interview everyone, you cannot review all the documents, and you can do that for one project, maybe 2 or 3 in a cascade, but extending it would make that sampling very loose, right? So you would omit or miss many components. There's still a way to go there, and I hopefully in the future we can make something like that. We just need to frame it very transparently, that by extending opening the focus from a project to a cascade, to a fleet, to a country, you will lose on the details. So the certification needs, if it goes that way, it needs to be very clear on that. It needs to keep its transparency on what is being certified and how detailed, how thorough is that certification. We're confident in certifying one project, but we still have some confidence in certifying a cascade that fits a number of that criteria. Going beyond that, I think that's very exciting, and it's something that we want to work on in the future. We're still not there yet, and we have to face the limitations, but Julian, we will be happy to work on that for sure and explore the pros and cons of that. And if that is better, a nice and a better way to understand the grid impacts of a project, of multiple projects, then why not? Let's build on what we have today and work on that direction as well. So exciting.
Thanks, João. That's really interesting. I think one of the issues I see with that is that if you think about Matthias's scenarios, then there were scenarios of hydropower mixed into a grid with other generation sources. And as you know, the Sustainability Assessment Protocol was designed to review hydropower. So we may actually get to a point where you need to assess a fleet of different generation activities which have different impacts together. And as exciting as it is to consider a range of hydropower options together, considering the diverse impacts of different forms of generation is just becomes hugely complex. Fascinating, but complex. And I think that we need to set that up as a long-term goal and to work towards it in the ways that different sustainability assessments can move in that direction. And I think that's, I'd really like to see that done for systems, because I think at the moment, when we're adding intermittent renewables to a system, we're not considering what the sideways impacts are of that in terms of what's going to back it up. And as Matthias said, the other day in Britain, we had to turn on coal-fired power because we ran out of wind and solar. And various other system things happened at the same time. But to be able to assess those impacts in the round is going to be very complex, but very interesting.
Yeah, Judith, indeed. And I think there are new extremes coming in the game. I mean, when we consider about extremes, I mean, the first thing that comes in our mind are hurricanes, earthquakes, or whatever. But these new extremes, I mean, these big changes in the weather and climatic conditions really affect the operation and planning of a low carbon system. And especially when we're moving to the renewable reach or 100% renewable systems. I mean, these are something that have to really come into play. I think Jamie said earlier as well, what happens as it did happen in Europe, if it doesn't blow for a big considerable amount of time, or we don't have sun. So what happens in this 100% renewable system? I mean, the answer lies in large-scale storage, mainly. I mean, let that be batteries or other forms of storage, but it is indeed a big challenge.
So any other questions? I'm having trouble seeing the hands up. So please, if you've got your hand up, just unmute yourself and shout. Jamie, from a social point of view, how far have we got in consulting communities in what generation options we should be using? Does anybody do that well?
I think a lot of people try and consult communities on particular dimensions. I mean, there are always village level discussions around solar panels and microgrids and all the things that you don't like, Judith. I suspect they're less consulted on extending the national grid to their communities. And I think that's a central government decision of trying to increase coverage, and it's simply delivered as part of a national program of infrastructure expansion. People are not asked to contribute financially to those investments. So I think that, I mean, when I look at the complexities of trying to reoperate hydropower and how difficult it is for communities to begin to understand how changes to river flow will affect them and their lifestyles, because we're not able to articulate that. We can't clearly say this plant will lead to this change in flow, which will lead to this change in this resource, which will impact your livelihood in the following way. And I think that people's ability to understand future or states of future river systems is very limited. And it's not simply small African communities or Asian communities that I'm talking about. My street was flooded 2 years ago in a major storm when the sewers backed up and flooded our basements. And in the ensuing discussions about what to do and what the risk is and what do we as a community want, it's quite obvious that people are just not able to think about risk and events and impacts and what the government's job is and what your individual responsibility is as a householder. And it's incredibly complicated to think it through and to come up with a community plan. So if you just multiply that by 10 and take it out to the Mekong or the Niger or or downstream of Akosombo with 470 odd villages to consult, yeah, it's not easy. And I don't think it's realistic to push energy and system planners to do that. And I think the challenge for those planners is to work out very clearly what they're consulting about and what information they can give to people before they start the consultation. Otherwise, people just say, what am I doing here? I just don't understand any of this. They're not able to answer any of my questions, and this is a futile consultation. So I think it requires developers or operators to go beyond the let's go and talk to that community and really think about what they're going to say and what levels of guarantee they can give and how they can articulate clearly the consequences of their actions in such a way that people can choose if they're being given a choice, because often they're just being informed and not consulted. And if they're just informing them, they should say that from the start and not give the suggestion that they're consulting them.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. So often we're providing information, not consulting, and there may be times when that's appropriate to begin with, but it needs to be very clear what it is that we're doing. Jeff, has WWF gone any further on issues of consultation?
Let's see, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to talk about that, other than, strong support for concepts and principles like free, prior, and informed consent, and the absolute importance, imperative of engaging the affected communities. I think, and one part of our position here is that, sure, consultation is important, but we're also beginning to get into the stage where governments have many other options beyond projects that have major impacts, where consultation would be so critical because so many communities are being affected. But there's also just many more opportunities to find alternatives to those kind of projects. I'm not saying a small project with impacts on certain communities doesn't require consultation, but I'm just, what have captivated our attention has been these major, projects on tributaries to the Amazon with indigenous people, or the Mekong River, and not just local people, but people who depend on migratory fish and people who depend on the sediment. And I mean, for example, the latest IEA projections that call for about 4,000 terawatt hours of hydropower by 2050, new terawatt hours of hydropower, or capacity sufficient to generate that. But that's out of about 62,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity they're calling for by 2050. And of that 4,000 terawatt hours that would be from new hydropower projects, less than 1,000 would be coming from the kind of big dams on tropical large rivers. That's so like 1% of the renewable energy by 2050. But if those were to be developed, half the remaining free-flowing large tropical rivers would become dammed and fragmented. And in fact, already half are dammed, so that would leave about a quarter. So you asked me about consultation, but I'm kind of framing back up to this kind of global picture. Like, well, do we need consultation on those kind of projects, or should we say that's less than 1% of the renewable energy we need by 2050? Maybe there are alternatives to that kind of hydropower. And then all projects will need good consultation, whether it's hydropower, wind, solar, whatever. So yeah, I took it a little bit further afield, but wanted to get that point in there. Thanks.
I think that's a really good point, Jeff. And we have to think about what it is that we want, and it's coming back to Matthias and Julian's work, which looks at the optimization. And one of the elements that we consider should be what percentage of free flowing rivers do we want to continue to be free flowing. We could optimize for that and consider, if we did that, what would be the impact on the way we run our systems. And when I've been involved in discussions with governments where they really said, don't tell me what kind of generation I can build. But I think that the kind of international cooperation and understanding that we're bringing to bear in the COP is the type that we could bring to bear on these issues. Maybe it is that the rest of the world has to help countries who feel that their only option is a large dam on a precious river. There's another comment on the chat. Oh, Professor Owen, how good to hear from you. Professor Owen, would you like to make your point to save me reading it? Nice to see you.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Very nice to see you again. You know that you know that the role of hydropower is very, very important to move the zero carbon future. You can see my comments because you know that it can compensate the unstable generation capacity from the intermittent renewable like wind and solar, because you know the generation the generated power from the hydropower is very stable. So you know that it can compensate the fluctuated generation from the solar and wind. Also, you know the advanced technology like the floating solar PV system can decrease the evaporation rate from the hydropower dams. So you know that it can contribute in the climate change adaptation. So we can use the floating solar PV as one of the feasible option for the adaptation of the climate change. Also, you know the additional capacity from the floating solar PV system can integrate it, and it can combine to the generated capacity from hydropower, and then they can send to the national grid system. Also, you know we can figure out the share of the hydropower in the world's renewable energy mix. So you can see that the hydropower is always largest, always larger than other renewables. You know, because in the last 20 years ago, that hydropower is the largest generation capacity. Also today, hydropower is the largest generating capacity. You know that there is the increasing rate of the solar and wind, but you know that their share is very little, and also we have the challenge like some of the power electronic and control problems regarding the solar and wind. Also, you know that is for the some of the country like Myanmar, you know, the electrification rate of Myanmar is just only 55%. Not all the whole country cannot be electrified. In such a country, the hydropower is very, very essential. And also, we have the big challenge to invest in the some of the renewable like solar and wind, because you know the national grid system of Myanmar is not very stable. I mean that the power system stability and power system resiliency is poor in the Myanmar national grid system. So we cannot generate the large capacity from the solar and wind because our national grid system is not stable. It's a challenge to integrate the intermittent generation to the national grid system. So for Myanmar, hydropower is very, very essential, and also we cannot neglect the role of hydropower. And also, in my opinion, also for the world, I think it may be the same, because you know there is a very advanced technology for the solar and wind, but maybe for the next 20 years or 30 years, the hydropower may be the largest generation capacity than the other renewables. It's just my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's really important that we get a view from countries who are still struggling with questions like access to energy, access to electricity, because sometimes we can work on an assumption that everybody has grid supplied or some form of electricity access. So thank you for reminding us of that. And also the opportunities for cogeneration with hydropower. You know, a hydropower dam is a really good place to put a wind turbine or floating solar. And there's now research on capturing methane at outfalls for generation. So there are a lot of cogeneration opportunities in a hydropower project, and we need to take advantage of every one of them, because the great advantage of a hydropower project is that the transmission lines are in place. So you can do smaller energy generation without having to build new transmission lines. So I fear that we've run out of time. I'd like to thank the panel hugely for a really fascinating discussion. So thank you, Matthias, Jeff, Jamie, Zhao. You didn't quite have to have a name that begins with J to get on this panel, but it helped. And thank you very much, everybody. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for sitting and listening and for your interesting questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you on another webinar.